March 19, 1976. Inside a sterile Pentagon briefing room, America's top military brass watched as Ben Rich, the new head of Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, rolled a single marble across the polished conference table. The tiny sphere clinked softly against the wood before coming to rest in front of a three-star general. "Gentlemen," Rich announced to the stunned silence, "here's the radar signature of your next fighter aircraft." Every advanced warplane in the world lit up enemy radar screens like a city bus. Soviet surface-to-air missiles were systematically destroying NATO jets over the Middle East. American pilots were dying because enemy radar could track them from hundreds of miles away. The Pentagon's own classified reports painted a terrifying picture. In any war with the Warsaw Pact, Western air power would be wiped out within days. But Rich wasn't just making promises. He was holding the solution, equations stolen from the enemy's own scientists, mathematical formulas that Soviet officials had dismissed as worthless theory, formulas that could make a full-sized fighter jet vanish from radar screens completely. The mad engineer had discovered something that would turn crashed UFO sightings in the Nevada desert into America's most deadly secret weapon. The marble's soft clink against the mahogany table echoed through the Pentagon briefing room like a gunshot. General Lawrence Skansa stared at the tiny sphere, then back at Ben Rich, searching the Lockheed engineer's face for any hint of a joke. There was none. Rich stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for the implications to sink in. Around the table, colonels and admirals shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. They had come expecting another PowerPoint presentation filled with aerodynamic charts and budget projections. Instead, they were witnessing what would become the most audacious promise in aviation history. The strategic crisis gripping NATO in 1976 was no secret to anyone in that room. 18 months earlier, during the Yom Kippur War, Israeli Air Force commanders had watched in horror as their most advanced fighters, the same F-4 Phantoms and A-4 Skyhawks that formed the backbone of American air power, fell from the sky like rain. Soviet-designed SA-6 surface-to-air missile systems had destroyed 102 Israeli aircraft in just 18 days. The Pentagon's classified post-war analysis painted an even grimmer picture. In any conflict with Warsaw Pact forces, NATO airstrikes against Eastern Europe would be suicide missions. The Soviet Union had transformed air defense from an art into a science. Their integrated radar networks could detect aircraft from hundreds of miles away, track multiple targets simultaneously, and guide missiles with lethal precision. American pilots training for European scenarios knew the brutal mathematics. Conventional aircraft had virtually zero chance of surviving over heavily defended targets. The electronic fence that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea represented more than just advanced technology. It was a strategic checkmate that threatened to render Western air power obsolete. Rich understood these grim realities better than most. As Kelly Johnson's hand-picked successor at Skunk Works, he had spent months touring NATO air bases and Pentagon briefing rooms, listening to generals describe scenarios that ended with American pilots dying in burning cockpits. The frustration in their voices was palpable. How could the world's most technologically advanced military find itself outmatched by Soviet engineers working in Moscow's gray, concrete institutes? The answer, Rich now knew, lay in a 20-page technical paper gathering dust in Lockheed's translation archives. 6 months earlier, Denis Overholser, a Ukrainian-born mathematician working as a technical translator, had been assigned to review a routine Soviet publication. The 1962 paper, titled Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction, had been written by Pyotr Ufimtsev, a physicist at Moscow's Institute of Radio Engineering. Soviet military officials had reviewed Ufimtsev's work and concluded it possessed no significant military value, a catastrophic miscalculation that would reshape the entire Cold War. Overholser's mathematical training allowed him to see what the Soviets had missed. Ufimtsev hadn't just derived abstract equations, he had cracked the fundamental code governing how electromagnetic waves scatter off complex surfaces. His formulas could predict, with unprecedented precision, exactly how radio energy would behave when it encountered different geometric shapes. For a radar engineer, This was the Holy Grail, mathematical tools that could make aircraft virtually disappear from enemy screens. When Overholser brought the paper to Rich's office in Burbank, the Skunk Works director grasped the implications immediately. The Russians had handed them the blueprint for invisibility, but transforming Ufimtsev's theoretical mathematics into operational hardware would require abandoning every aerodynamic principle that had governed flight since the Wright brothers. Traditional aircraft achieved efficiency through smooth, curved surfaces that sliced cleanly through the air. Stealth aircraft would need angular, faceted designs that scattered radar waves in carefully controlled directions, geometries that looked more like crystalline formations than flying machines. Rich faced immediate resistance from the man he respected most, Kelly Johnson himself. The legendary founder of Skunk Works had built his career on smoothly blended shapes, aircraft that achieved their revolutionary performance through elegant aerodynamic refinement. The U-2 spy plane and SR-71 Blackbird represented the pinnacle of Johnson's philosophy, form following function through graceful, organic curves. Rich's proposal struck Johnson as fundamentally wrong-headed, a violation of everything they had learned about creating successful aircraft. The technical debates between mentor and protege grew heated. Johnson argued that radical shaping would create aircraft too unstable to fly safely, too slow to survive combat, and too exotic to maintain in operational squadrons. Rich countered that invisibility trumped every other consideration. An aircraft that couldn't be detected could afford to sacrifice speed, maneuverability, and payload capacity. The future belonged to platforms that struck without warning, not those that relied on raw performance to survive air defenses. To prove his concept, Rich assembled a small team of engineers and tasked them with creating a computer program capable of analyzing how radar waves would interact with complex geometric surfaces. The software, dubbed Echo 1, represented a breakthrough in computational electromagnetics, the first tool that could accurately predict the radar signature of arbitrarily shaped objects. When they fed Ufimtsev's equations into the program and began testing different aircraft configurations, the results were revolutionary. The winning design looked like nothing that had ever flown. Angular and faceted, covered in flat triangular surfaces that met at sharp edges, it resembled a geometric crystal more than an aircraft. Engineers dubbed it the hopeless diamond for its bizarre, multifaceted appearance. Computer simulations suggested its radar cross-section would be smaller than a marble, effectively invisible to detection systems designed to track barn door-sized returns from conventional fighters. But simulations were just mathematics. Rich needed proof that would convince skeptical generals to risk American lives on his revolutionary concept. The moment of truth would come at a radar test range in California's Mojave Desert, where a wooden scale model would either validate years of theoretical work or expose the stealth program as an expensive delusion. The McDonnell Douglas radar test range sprawled across 30 square miles of California desert, its collection of antennas and measurement equipment baking under the relentless Mojave sun. On this March morning in 1976, Ben Rich's small team arrived in a convoy of unmarked trucks, carrying what appeared to be an elaborate piece of modern art wrapped in protective canvas. The 10-foot wooden model they unloaded looked like a child's attempt to build an airplane from geometric building blocks, all sharp angles and triangular facets that caught the desert light in strange, fractured patterns. Rich watched his engineers mount the hopeless diamond on a standard 12-foot test pole, positioning it 1,500 feet from the radar array. The setup was routine, identical to procedures used for testing conventional aircraft models for decades, but nothing about this test would prove routine. Dick Cantrell, the McDonnell Douglas radar operator, powered up the system and began his standard calibration sequence, adjusting the equipment to detect objects the size of small aircraft at close range. Within seconds, Cantrell frowned at his display screen. The radar return showed nothing but electronic noise, the random scatter pattern typical of empty airspace. He checked his equipment settings, verified the antenna alignment, and ran a diagnostic sequence. Everything appeared normal, yet the screen remained blank where the Lockheed model should have registered as a bright, unmistakable blip. Cantrell turned to Rich with genuine concern etched across his weathered face. "The model must have fallen off the pole," he announced matter-of-factly. I'm getting no return signal whatsoever. The radar operator had spent 20 years testing aircraft signatures, from tiny drones to massive cargo planes. In his experience, objects simply didn't disappear from radar screens unless they physically weren't there. Rich felt his pulse quicken. The computer simulations had predicted this exact result, but witnessing it in reality carried a weight that mathematics couldn't convey. He walked alongside Cantrell toward the test pole, their boots crunching on the desert hardpan. The model remained exactly where they had mounted it, intact, secure, and clearly visible to the human eye. Cantrell stared at the angular wooden structure, then back at his radar display, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with what his instruments reported. They returned to the radar console for a systematic investigation. Cantrell adjusted the system's sensitivity to maximum gain, boosting the signal strength far beyond normal operating parameters. The screen remained stubbornly empty. He switched to different radar frequencies, cycling through the electromagnetic spectrum like a radio operator searching for a distant station. Still nothing. Only when the model rotated to a perfectly perpendicular angle, presenting its flat surface directly toward the radar beam, did the system register a brief, flickering return. The moment the model moved even slightly off perpendicular, it vanished again. Rich's team documented every aspect of the test with scientific precision. They photographed the model from multiple angles, recorded radar returns at different frequencies, and measured signal strength across various orientations. The data confirmed what Ufimtsev's equations had predicted. The faceted design scattered electromagnetic energy in highly directional beams, sending radar waves everywhere except back toward their source. A conventional aircraft reflected radio energy in all directions like a mirror ball, creating the bright returns that radar operators used for tracking. The hopeless diamond functioned more like a collection of precisely angled mirrors, redirecting energy into narrow beams that missed the receiver entirely. Word of the successful test reached Washington within hours, triggering a cascade of classified meetings across the Pentagon. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency officials, who had been cautiously optimistic about stealth concepts, suddenly found themselves managing a program with world-changing implications. The agency awarded Lockheed a $37 million contract under the codename Have Blue to build 2 full-scale flying prototypes that would prove stealth technology could work on operational aircraft. The engineering challenges facing Rich's expanded team defied conventional wisdom about aircraft design. The Have Blue prototypes would weigh 12,500 pounds and be powered by 2 General Electric J85 engines borrowed from the T2C Buckeye trainer, modest power plants that reflected the aircraft's emphasis on stealth over raw performance. More critically, the faceted design that made the aircraft invisible also made it inherently unstable, requiring fly-by-wire computer controls to remain airborne. Without constant electronic corrections, the angular geometry would send the aircraft tumbling out of control. The contradiction struck at aviation's core principles. Since the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk, successful aircraft had achieved stability through careful attention to aerodynamic balance. Wings, fuselage, and control surfaces worked together to create natural stability that allowed pilots to fly without constant intervention. Rich's stealth fighter abandoned this fundamental approach, trading inherent stability for radar invisibility. Computers would have to replace aerodynamic grace with split-second electronic reflexes. Construction of the Have Blue prototypes required innovations in materials science that pushed American manufacturing capabilities to their limits. Traditional aluminum construction would create unwanted radar returns at panel joints and surface discontinuities. Instead, Lockheed engineers developed new techniques for bonding composite materials into seamless surfaces, eliminating the gaps and seams that could betray an aircraft's presence to enemy sensors. Every rivet, antenna, and access panel required careful analysis to ensure it wouldn't compromise the aircraft's invisibility. The program's security classification reached levels typically reserved for nuclear weapons development. Workers at Lockheed's Burbank facility signed agreements acknowledging that unauthorized disclosure could result in decades of imprisonment. Even within Skunk Works, engineers worked on compartmentalized subsystems, with only a handful of senior staff understanding how the components integrated into a complete aircraft. The prototype construction took place in heavily guarded hangars, protected by multiple layers of physical security and electronic surveillance. By late 1977, the first Have-Blue prototype neared completion. Rich found himself dividing time between technical oversight and political management, briefing increasingly senior Pentagon officials about a program that challenged fundamental assumptions about air warfare. The aircraft represented more than technological innovation. It embodied a new philosophy that prioritized invisibility over speed, stealth over strength. Whether that philosophy could translate from theoretical success into operational reality would depend on test flights conducted in the desert airspace above Area 51, where America's most classified aviation programs had always faced their ultimate trials. The Have-Blue prototype sat in Hangar 18 at Groom Lake like a geometric puzzle awaiting assembly. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting of Area 51's most classified facility, the aircraft's angular surfaces created a maze of sharp shadows that seemed to shift with each observer's movement. Test pilot Bill Park circled the machine slowly, running his hands along seams where composite panels met at precise angles. Everything about the aircraft violated his instincts, developed over 2 decades of flying conventional jets. Park had flown the SR-71 Blackbird to the edge of space, mastering an aircraft that demanded split-second reflexes and absolute precision. But the Blackbird, for all its exotic performance, still behaved like a traditional airplane. Its smooth curves and graceful proportions reflected aerodynamic principles that Park understood intuitively. The Have-Blue represented something fundamentally different, an aircraft that existed not because of aerodynamic efficiency, but in spite of it. The first taxi tests revealed the challenges immediately. Without fly-by-wire computers constantly adjusting control surfaces, the faceted design created unpredictable airflow patterns that sent the aircraft lurching across the runway like a drunk pedestrian. Park's initial attempts at high-speed taxi runs required fierce concentration just to maintain directional control. The aircraft wanted to weather vane into crosswinds, pitch nose up without warning, and generally behave unlike anything in his extensive flight experience. November the 20th, 1977 marked the first official flight attempt. Park strapped himself into the cramped cockpit, surrounded by experimental avionics and backup systems that reflected the prototype's uncertain reliability. The ejection seat had been modified to account for the aircraft's unusual flight characteristics, with explosive charges timed to clear the pilot safely even if the aircraft was tumbling out of control. As Park advanced the throttles for takeoff, he felt the familiar surge of jet engines spooling up. But everything else about the experience defied convention. The Have-Blue lifted off after a longer-than-normal ground roll, climbing with the labored effort of an aircraft fighting its own aerodynamic design. Park's first impression was of an airplane that flew reluctantly, requiring constant attention to prevent departure from controlled flight. The flight computers worked overtime to interpret his control inputs and translate them into commands that kept the aircraft stable. Without those electronic systems, Park knew he would have been riding an uncontrollable projectile. During the 20-minute test flight, Park explored the aircraft's basic handling characteristics with extreme caution. Simple maneuvers like gentle turns and altitude changes required careful coordination between pilot inputs and computer responses. The aircraft exhibited none of the natural stability that pilots relied upon for situational awareness. Instead, it flew like a controlled experiment in applied physics, remaining airborne only through constant electronic intervention. The landing proved more challenging than takeoff. Park discovered that the aircraft's unusual configuration created unpredictable ground effects as he approached the runway. Air flowing under and around the faceted surfaces behaved differently than conventional aerodynamics predicted, requiring him to adjust his approach speed and descent rate based on feel rather than established procedures. The touchdown was firm but controlled, marking the successful completion of stealth technology's first flight test. Post-flight analysis revealed both promise and problems. The Have-Blue had demonstrated that a radar-invisible aircraft could indeed fly, validating Rich's fundamental concept. But the prototype also exhibited handling qualities that would challenge even the most experienced military pilots. The flight computers required constant fine-tuning to prevent dangerous oscillations, and the aircraft's limited payload capacity raised questions about operational effectiveness. Over the following months, Park and his fellow test pilots gradually expanded the HAV-Blue's flight envelope. They discovered that the aircraft performed best at moderate speeds and altitudes, with handling characteristics that improved once pilots adapted their techniques to accommodate the fly-by-wire controls. The angular design that made the aircraft invisible also created unique acoustic signatures. Locals around Area 51 began reporting strange engine sounds, unlike any conventional military aircraft. The UFO connection proved both amusing and concerning to program officials. The HAV-Blue's otherworldly appearance, combined with its secretive test flights at high altitude, generated hundreds of unidentified flying object reports from civilian observers. Intelligence analysts noted with dark humor that the American public was simultaneously witnessing their nation's most advanced military technology while dismissing it as science fiction. The disconnect provided excellent cover for the classified program, but also highlighted how radically different stealth aircraft appeared compared to conventional designs. Rich received regular briefings about flight test progress from his office in Burbank, balancing technical concerns against schedule pressures from Pentagon sponsors. The HAV-Blue program faced constant scrutiny from military officials who questioned whether an aircraft requiring such extensive computer assistance could prove reliable in combat conditions. Traditional fighter pilots expressed skepticism about fly-by-wire controls, preferring direct mechanical linkages that provided immediate feedback about aircraft behavior. The prototype testing phase revealed fundamental truths about stealth technology's operational requirements. The aircraft's radar-absorbing materials required careful maintenance to preserve their electromagnetic properties, with even minor surface damage potentially compromising the stealth characteristics. Ground crews needed specialized training to service systems that bore little resemblance to conventional aircraft components. Most critically, the faceted design imposed severe constraints on payload capacity and operational flexibility. By mid-1978, the HAV-Blue had completed dozens of test flights, proving that stealth aircraft could operate safely within carefully defined parameters. The program's success triggered Pentagon discussions about developing an operational stealth fighter based on lessons learned from the experimental prototypes. Rich found himself preparing proposals for a production aircraft that would incorporate HAV-Blue's revolutionary invisibility while addressing the prototype's operational limitations. The transition from experimental proof of concept to operational weapon system would require scaling up manufacturing processes, training military pilots, and developing maintenance procedures for aircraft, unlike anything in the Air Force inventory. Rich's team faced the challenge of transforming laboratory success into battlefield capability, knowing that their next aircraft would carry American pilots into combat against the world's most sophisticated air defense systems. The production F-117 Nighthawk emerged from Lockheed's Palmdale facility, bearing little resemblance to its angular HAV-Blue ancestors. Rich's engineering team had refined the faceted geometry into a more sophisticated design that maintained radar invisibility while improving aerodynamic performance. The operational aircraft stretched 43 feet in length with a wingspan of 37 feet, powered by two General Electric F-404 engines that eliminated the prototype's chronic underpowering issues. Most importantly, the production model incorporated lessons learned from hundreds of test flights, transforming an experimental curiosity into a weapon system capable of penetrating the world's most heavily defended airspace. June 18, 1981, Ben Rich's 55th birthday, marked a pivotal moment for the stealth program. At Groom Lake, test pilot Hal Farley prepared for the F-117's first official flight, strapping himself into a cockpit that represented 5 years of intensive development since the HAV-Blue's maiden voyage. The production aircraft incorporated radar-absorbing materials throughout its structure, reducing its signature to 0.001 square meters, roughly equivalent to 3 insects on radar screens designed to track automobile-sized objects. Farley's takeoff proceeded smoothly, the F-117 climbing steadily into Nevada's crystalline desert air. Unlike the HAV-Blue's labored ascent, the production aircraft demonstrated stable flight characteristics that would allow military pilots to master its unique handling qualities through conventional training programs. The fly-by-wire controls had evolved from experimental technology into reliable systems that translated pilot inputs into precise aircraft responses, eliminating the dangerous oscillations that had plagued the early prototypes. During the 40-minute test flight, Farley explored the F-117's operational envelope with the confidence born of extensive simulator preparation. The aircraft responded predictably to control inputs, maintained stable flight attitudes through various maneuvers, and demonstrated the subsonic performance characteristics that Pentagon officials had specified for the operational requirement. Unlike conventional fighters designed for air-to-air combat, the F-117 sacrificed speed and maneuverability for its revolutionary invisibility, accepting limitations that would have been unthinkable for previous generation aircraft. The stealth requirements imposed severe constraints on the F-117's operational capabilities that reflected fundamental trade-offs between invisibility and traditional performance measures. The aircraft carried no afterburners to avoid creating infrared signatures that heat-seeking missiles could track. Its subsonic speed limitation prevented the shock waves and acoustic signatures that would compromise stealth characteristics. Most critically, the internal weapons bay could accommodate only two 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs, a payload capacity that seemed modest compared to conventional attack aircraft carrying multiple tons of ordnance. Rich understood that these limitations represented strategic choices rather than engineering failures. The F-117's mission profile emphasized precision strikes against high-value targets in heavily defended areas where conventional aircraft couldn't survive. A single stealth fighter delivering 2 bombs against a critical command center or communications facility could achieve strategic effects impossible for entire squadrons of conventional aircraft facing integrated air defense systems. Quality of targeting would replace quantity of weapons in the calculus of modern air warfare. The aircraft's exotic appearance continued generating UFO reports from civilians observing test flights around Area 51. The F-117's angular silhouette, combined with its unusual flight characteristics and secretive operations, created perfect conditions for mistaken identification as extraterrestrial technology. Intelligence officials noted with satisfaction that public fascination with flying saucers provided excellent cover for the world's most classified military aircraft, allowing test operations to continue without arousing serious media attention about actual defense programs. In October 1983, the 4450 Tactical Group achieved initial operating capability with 14 production F-117 aircraft stationed at Tonopah Test Range, Nevada. The unit operated under elaborate cover as an A-7D Corsair II training squadron, maintaining the fiction through carefully staged activities that would satisfy casual observation. Squadron personnel lived double lives, commuting to their classified workplace while maintaining cover stories about conventional fighter operations that explained their extended absences from home. The operational squadron developed tactics and procedures for employing stealth aircraft in combat scenarios that had no historical precedent. Unlike conventional fighters that relied on speed, altitude, or electronic countermeasures to survive in hostile airspace, the F-117 depended entirely on remaining undetected by enemy sensors. Mission planning required precise knowledge of radar coverage, flight paths that avoided detection zones, and timing that maximized the element of surprise against targets expecting conventional attack profiles. Pilot training for the F-117 demanded adaptation to flight characteristics unlike any previous military aircraft. The subsonic performance and limited maneuverability required different tactical approaches compared to air superiority fighters designed for high-speed combat. Pilots learned to think like invisible assassins rather than aerial warriors, emphasizing stealth and precision over speed and firepower. The psychological adjustment proved as challenging as mastering the aircraft's technical systems. For 5 years, the F-117 remained America's most closely guarded military secret, unknown to Congress, the media, and most Pentagon officials. The aircraft's existence was compartmentalized at levels typically reserved for nuclear weapons programs, with access limited to personnel holding the highest security clearances. Even routine maintenance activities required special procedures to prevent unauthorized disclosure of the aircraft's revolutionary capabilities. Rich monitored the operational development from Lockheed's Burbank headquarters, tracking flight hours and mission readiness statistics that measured the stealth program's transition from experimental technology to operational capability. The F-117 was accumulating the flight experience and maintenance data necessary to support combat operations, proving that invisible aircraft could function as reliable military systems rather than exotic prototypes. By late 1989, as tensions escalated in Panama following General Manuel Noriega's increasingly erratic behavior, Pentagon planners began considering the F-117 for its first combat employment. The aircraft that had emerged from Russian mathematical equations and American engineering audacity was approaching the ultimate test of any military technology: validation in actual warfare against an enemy who would shoot back with deadly intent. December 19, 1989, marked the F-117's baptism by fire during Operation Just Cause in Panama. Two Nighthawks from the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing lifted off from Tonopah Test Range under cover of darkness, their angular silhouettes disappearing into the Nevada night like geometric phantoms. The mission profile called for surgical precision strikes against Panamanian Defense Force barracks at Rio Hato, designed to minimize civilian casualties while demonstrating American technological superiority to a watching world. Major Greg Feast piloted the lead aircraft, following a carefully planned route that avoided commercial air traffic and radar coverage from neighboring countries. The F-117's subsonic cruise speed meant the flight to Panama required multiple aerial refuelings, each rendezvous conducted with tanker aircraft whose crews remained unaware they were servicing America's most classified warplane. The stealth fighters approached their targets in complete radio silence, relying on precise navigation and timing to coordinate their attack without electronic emissions that could compromise their invisibility. The strikes themselves lasted mere seconds. Both F-117 aircraft released their 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs with the clinical precision that stealth operations demanded, then turned north toward friendly airspace without waiting to observe the results. Panamanian radar operators registered no incoming aircraft, no warning of approaching attack, no opportunity to activate defensive systems. The bombs simply materialized from empty sky, striking their targets with devastating accuracy before the defending forces understood they were under assault. Post-strike analysis confirmed that stealth technology had performed exactly as Rich's team had promised. Both aircraft completed their missions undetected, proving that the F-117 could deliver precision munitions against defended targets while remaining completely invisible to enemy sensors. The Panama operation represented more than tactical success. It validated 15 years of theoretical development, experimental testing, and operational preparation that had transformed Russian mathematical equations into American combat capability. The Persian Gulf crisis that erupted following Iraq's August 2, 1990 invasion of Kuwait presented stealth technology with its ultimate challenge. Iraqi forces had constructed one of the world's most sophisticated air defense networks, integrating 7,000 radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, 9,000 infrared-guided missiles, 7,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 800 fighter aircraft through computerized command systems that could coordinate multiple threats against incoming attackers. No conventional aircraft could survive over heavily defended targets like Baghdad, where layers of overlapping coverage created electronic killing fields designed to destroy any visible aircraft. Rich studied intelligence assessments of Iraqi capabilities from his Lockheed office, recognizing that Saddam Hussein's air defense system represented the perfect test case for stealth technology. The integrated radar networks, coordinated command structures, and dense missile coverage created exactly the threat environment that had motivated the F-117's development. If stealth aircraft could penetrate Iraqi defenses and strike strategic targets in downtown Baghdad, they could operate anywhere in the world against any conceivable enemy. The 37th Tactical Fighter Wing deployed 42 F-117 aircraft to Khamis Mushait Air Base in Saudi Arabia during late 1990, establishing the largest concentration of operational stealth fighters in military history. The deployment required unprecedented security measures to protect America's most classified technology in a forward combat zone. Ground crews worked in heavily guarded hangars. Maintenance procedures followed strict protocols to prevent intelligence compromise. And even routine flight operations required special clearances to avoid exposing stealth capabilities to unauthorized observation. Pentagon planners faced agonizing decisions about employing the F-117 in large-scale combat operations. The aircraft represented decades of development investment and technological advantages that could be compromised if even a single example was shot down and recovered by Soviet advisors working with Iraqi forces. Some officials argued for limiting stealth operations to reduce exposure risks, while others insisted that the F-117's unique capabilities made it essential for mission success against the most critical targets. Rich found himself briefing senior Pentagon officials about operational employment concepts that had no historical precedent. Unlike conventional aircraft that relied on mass formations and electronic countermeasures for survival, stealth fighters would operate individually or in small groups, penetrating enemy airspace through gaps in radar coverage that only invisible aircraft could exploit. The F-117's limited payload capacity meant that target selection required extraordinary precision. Each bomb had to achieve strategic effects that justified the risks of exposing America's most classified military technology. As H-hour for Operation Desert Storm approached, uncertainty gripped the stealth community despite years of successful testing and training. The F-117 had never faced modern integrated air defenses in large-scale warfare, never operated in the electromagnetic environment created by hundreds of active radar systems, never confronted the coordinated response of enemy fighters and missiles working together to destroy invisible intruders. Computer simulations suggested the aircraft would remain undetectable, but combat operations created variables that no laboratory could replicate. The weight of strategic responsibility pressed down on Rich and the F-117 community as January 17, 1991 approached. Decades of theoretical work, billions of development dollars, and America's technological supremacy in the post-Cold War era hung in the balance. The stealth revolution that had begun with Ufimtsev's forgotten equations and Rich's revolutionary vision was about to face the ultimate validation in the skies over Baghdad. January 17th, 3 o'clock, a.m. Baghdad time, 10 F-117. Nighthawks crossed into Iraqi airspace invisible to enemy radar systems. The lead aircraft, piloted by Major Jerry Leatherman, approached a telecommunications center in downtown Baghdad, carrying the first bomb of Operation Desert Storm. Below, Iraqi air defense operators stared at radar screens showing clear skies, their sophisticated detection systems registering no incoming threats, despite the approach of American warplanes that would systematically dismantle Saddam Hussein's command structure over the following hours. The moment that would define stealth technology's place in military history was unfolding in the darkness above the Middle East, where Russian mathematics and American engineering were about to prove that invisibility had indeed replaced firepower as the decisive factor in modern warfare.